ملان على خاتم النبيين وسيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما إلى علمنا. Inshallah, we'll pick back up from the book known as the Musannaf of Abi Bakr Abdullah ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Shaybah rahimahullah ta'ala rahmatan wasi'ah, who died in the year 235 after the Hijrah. And we are still in the section of his book known as Kitab al-Tahara, the section that deals with purification. And we've reached the chapter that the author, chapter 51, where the author, he entitles it, Fil Wudu bil Ma' al-Ajin. This chapter is what has been narrated regarding making wudu with water that is ajin. An ajin, what that means is that water that has changed its taste or its color or its smell due to how long it has sat. The cause of the change is due to how long it has sitting still or sitting still. And so it's that stale, stagnant water, that water that sits for a while, and thus it causes its taste, its color, or its smell to change. A quick benefit, when we talk about the causes of what changes water, then you have a taghyir binafsihi, when it changes by itself. And that is what we're referring to in this chapter, ma al-ajin, water that has changed by itself. Nothing has happened, but just because of how long it has been there, its taste, its color, or its smell has changed. Then you have water taghayyara bil mujawara, water that has changed because of proximity. Not because something has actually entered into it, but because it was in the proximity of something that has affected its smell, its taste, or its color. So, like, for example, classically, they give the example of a body of water surrounding which there is Karen, there is dead animals, meta. The smell and the wind will carry that smell of those animals to the water. So when you scoop from that water, it will smell like those animals. And even though its taste or its color has changed, it has changed due to mujawara, proximity, not due to mukhalata, not due to mixing. And thus it has a different rule than the rules of that which relate to water that has changed due to mixing. Then you have water that has changed due to yani mukhalata. And this is what I mean by mukhalata in this context, is that something has been placed in it that does not dissolve in it. So it's mixed, but it is not dissolved into it. So like, for example, if you put a rock in water and then take the rock out, the entirety of the rock leaves and there is no more rock in the water. And so this is what they consider to be mukhalata. Right? There is something in the water. There is something in the water. And then a fourth type of cause that can change the water's taste, color, or smell is mumazaja. And mumazaja is when the substance that has been placed in the water completely dissolves in the water to the extent that you can't remove one from the other. So like, for example, salt or sugar or urine, these type of things, when they get into the water, they completely mix with the water, and thus you can't extract it after it has gone into the water. So these are some of the things, or some of the descriptors of what causes the water to change. Water that changes by itself, which is what our chapter is today, Ma'al Ajin, as well as water that changes due to proximity, right? Al-Mujawara. And then you have water that changes from mukhalata, right? You put something into the water, but it doesn't mix with it. And then you have water that changes due to mumazaja, where you put something into the water and it completely dissolves and mix and it becomes one with the water to where you can't separate the two of them, I generally speaking. And so today we have with us the chapter of Al-Wudu bil-Ma' al-Ajin. What is the rule about making wudu with water that has changed by itself? And obviously, as we know, this is because we see the disagreement of the scholars regarding Ma'at Tahur and Ma'at Tahir. What is the difference between them, if there is a difference? And so some of them consider water that has changed not due to something najis, then it no longer deserves the absolute title water, and thus it is not Ma'at Tahur. It's not Ma'al Mutlaq. And so they remove it from being that water that is usable. But here the author is going to talk about, well, what if that change occurred because of nothing but the water itself, and it's tul al-mukth, it's long sitting. The Sheikh Ash-Shithri, hafidhahullah ta'ala, he mentions in his commenting on this topic, he says, Al-Jumhur wa minhum al-a'immatul arba'a ala jawaz al-wudu'i bil-ma' al-ajin. وهو الماء المتغير بسبب طول مكثه مع عدم اختلاطه بشيء يغيره. Sheikh Ash-Shithri, hafidhahullah, he says that the majority of the scholars, and from them are the four imams, they all hold the view that it is jaiz, it is yajuz, it is permissible, it is mubah to use this water or to make wudu with this water that is ajin, to make wudu with this stale, stagnant water. And he explains what does the word ajin mean. He says, and it is that water that has changed because of how long it has sat, without there being anything that has mixed with it or has been placed in it to cause that change. It is water that has changed due to how long it has sat, without there being anything to have mixed with it and cause that change. And we see this water that sits in a pot, water that might be sitting in the pipes when you first turn on your sink in an old house, and that water comes out, and it might be gray, it might be brown, but nothing has mixed with it, right? And the pig-headed person will say, well, no, actually the iron and the rust and the pipes and things like this. But the generality of the statement is that nothing has mixed with it. The water that has sat and out, you left a cup out for a week and it starts to smell, the water, in the freezer, when you open up an old freezer and that it has that stench. This is because of the water, that ma al-ajin. And so let's see what some of the Salaf said regarding making wudu with this water. He says, حدثنا حشيم قال أخبرنا بن عون عن ابن سيرين أنه كان يكره الوضوء بالماء الآجن. The first ruling that he mentions, he says that Hushaym narrated to us, he said that Ibn Aun informed us, he said on the authority of Ibn Sirin, he said, Ibn Aun said about Ibn Sirin, that he used to dislike using wudu or making wudu with water that was ajin. So Muhammad ibn Sirin, he used to dislike using ajin water, using stale water to make wudu. And so here we see, even though Sheikh Ash-Shithri, he mentioned that it was the majority of the ulama, which it is, the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, Ibn Abi Shayba, he's presenting first somebody who disliked it, somebody who said it was makruh. He goes on, he says, حدثنا حشيم قال أخبرنا عباد بن ميسرة عن الحسن أنه كان لا يرى بأسا بالوضوء بالماء الآجن. He says that Hushaym narrated to us, he said that Abbad ibn Maysara informed us on the authority of Al-Hasan that he used to not see any harm making wudu with that water that is ajin. So Al-Hasan al-Basri, he used to not see there being any harm in making wudu from the water that is ajin, that water that its taste, color, or smell has changed due to how long it has sat, that stagnant, stale water. Ibn Abi Shayba, he says, حدثنا محمد بن يزيد عن داود بن عمرو قال سمعت القاسم بن مخيمرة يكره أن يتوضأ أو أن يتوضأ بالماء الآجن. Abu Bakr, he says that Muhammad ibn Yazid narrated to us on the authority of Dawood ibn Amr, who said, I heard Al-Qasim ibn Mukhaymara used to dislike wudu being made with water that was ajin. Al-Qasim, he used to dislike wudu being made from water that is ajin. He says, حدثنا عبيد الله ابن موسى عن يزيد بن إبراهيم قال سئل قتادة عن الماء الذي قد أروح أن أتوضأ به قال لا بأس بالماء الطرق والماء الرنق والماء الرنق قال الطرق الذي تطرقه الدواب وتخوضه والرنق الذي قد أروح. He says that Ubaydullah ibn Musa narrated to us on the authority of Yazid ibn Ibrahim, who said Qatada, yani Qatada ibn Di'ama, he was asked about the water that has arwaha, the water that has begun to smell. This is how I understand this statement, but let's see. Arwaha, the way I understand that statement is begin to produce a ra'iha, arwaha. Let's double check. It doesn't hurt to double check. Arwaha. It's on the scale af'ala min rih. Arwaha. And so that's the reason I say just by reading it, it means to produce a smell. But let's double check. Oh, arwaha. أروح الماء تورحت الماء بالمروحة يقال الريح والريحة عادت إلى الواو ريح وريحة كما قال دار ودارة وفي الحديث هبت الأرواح النصر. Okay. وأروحتها وجدتها في الحديث أعان على المؤمن أروح السبع الريح وأراحها استروحت. نعم. وأروح اللحم تغير رائحته. Now, so arwaha, it means to produce a smell. So Qatada ibn Di'ama, he was asked about making wudu from the water that has begun to produce a smell. And he said, responding to that, لا بأس بالماء الطرق. There is no harm with using the water that has been approached, الطرق, right? The water of the path. The water that has been approached, al-matruqa, yani that water that has been approached or has been, it's on the path, it has been trampled, something like this, how you wanted to translate. He's going to explain it in the narration. He says, and likewise, there's no harm with the water that is ranq, right? And he's going to explain what he means by that. Ranq, this is a word I'm not used to, even though they're going to explain it in the narration. Let's see if we can see what the origin of it is. Ranaqa. راء دال رنق. الرنق تراب في الماء من القذى ونحوه والرنق بالتحريك مصدر قولك رنق الماء بالكسر رنق الماء ورنق ورنوق ورنق بالتسكين وهو الرنق ورنق ترنق كدرة, right? The cloudy, the polluted water. He says, they asked Qatada about the water that has produced a smell, making wudu from it. And he said, there's no problem with that water of the path or that approached water, nor with the water that is yani kedir, that dirty water or that smelly water. And he said that a turuq, the meaning of water of the path, is that water that has been approached by the wild animals and they have entered into it, right? You might have a body of water where the wild beast drink from it and even at times go into the water. Then that water, there's no harm with it, even though it's been approached by these animals and its color and its smell has changed. Qatada is saying there's no harm with it. And likewise, he says with water that is ranq, it is the water that has produced a smell. And so here we see the statement of Qatada being even a little bit more informative as it relates to what is ma' al-ajin. So al-ma' al-ajin, as we said, is that water that doesn't have anything that mixes with it, but in spite of that, its color, taste, or smell changes because of how long it sat. And so even if the water changed because of what drunk from it or because of what went into it from the animals, i.e., and so when they go into it, the dirt that is on their hooves and the mud and things like that that gets into the water and causes it to become cloudy, Qatada is saying there's no harm with this water. And likewise, he says with that water that is rank, and that water that is rank to him is that rank water, right? And maybe that's where the word rank comes from. That would be interesting to look. But that water that is rank in its smell, its ra'iha has begun to change, not because of anything in it. And so this is the statement of Qatada. He goes on, he says, حدثنا وكيع عن أبي العميس عن أبي الربيع قال كنت مع عبد الرحمن بن أبي ليلى فمر بماء تخوض به الدواب وتبول فيه فقال لا بأس بالوضوء منه. He said that Waki' narrated to us on the authority of Abi, on the authority of Abil Umais, on the authority of Abil Rabi', who says, I was with Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Layla, the famous tabi, Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Layla, and he passed by a body of water that animals were going into, and they were urinating into it as well. And he said, there's no harm in making wudu from this water. And so this is the statement. As we said, these statements are even more extensive than just responding to that water that is ajin. So if this water that has animals going into it and urinating into it, even if the taste or color has, or the smell has changed because of it, then how much more so that water that has changed its taste, color, or smell by nothing, because of just by it sitting there for a while. And so that's how these narrations are being referenced and why they're being mentioned in this chapter. Obviously, this narration, it gives us some questions to answer, which is this water that the animals were going into. It must have either been a large body of water that the change of them going into and out of and urinating in and drinking out of didn't affect the overall body. That is one possibility. Or the possibility of it is that the animals that are being referenced here are animals that are tahir, like cows and camels and sheep and goat, to where if they go into the water or drink out of the water, or even if they urinate into the water and the water changes, it doesn't cause it to become najis. And so even if it changed, it didn't become najis because this water was changed by a pure substance. And this would be the statement of Qatada and Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Layla, saying that that water is still tahur instead of tahir. And so these are, different understandings that need to be comprehended as it relates to this circumstance where these animals are going into the water, drinking out of the water, urinating into the water. And even with that, these scholars allowed the wudu from such water. And that is because either the water did not change, which wouldn't be relevant to the topic at hand, because the topic at hand is relating to water that has changed. So it's more likely that the author is using this to refer to animals that were tahir, that changed the water. And if those animals that are tahir, that changed the water, that water could still be used to make wudu from, then how much more so water that has not changed or that has changed because of how long it sat. So this is that topic of making wudu with water that is ajin. The next chapter, he says, من قال الماء اليسير أحب إلي من التيمم. This chapter is regarding the one who says a small amount of water is more beloved to me than making tayammum. Right? If you have a small amount of water and it might not be enough to make an entire wudu, what should you do? Should you disregard using the water and make tayammum? Or should you make wudu to the extent that you can and then make tayammum for what's left? Or should you make wudu to the extent that you can and that's all you can do and there's no need for tayammum? Right? What do you do when you have a small amount of water that isn't sufficient? And these, a brother and I had a conversation today about something that we had talked about before, which is some of the rulings that might be unique for individuals who live their life on the road, like truck drivers and things like that. These type of chapters are very necessary for those type of individuals, right? The water that has changed because of how it has sat, for a long period of time. If you're driving, if you're on a trip and the bathroom is out of order and there's no water in the restroom or the rest area, but there's water in a puddle, right? That is tahur. Even though, maybe birds or rainwater has piled up and collected off to the side of the road or in a puddle or in the grass, is it necessary to use that water? Right? And if that water has changed, but not because of something impure, is it necessary to use that water? Even though you might find it off-putting, does the religion necessitate that you use such water? Likewise, if you don't have enough water, you were driving, the time had gotten late, you stop, the rest area is down, and all you have is a half of a bottle of water, and that's not enough for you to make wudu. That's what this chapter is talking about now. Those who say a small amount of water is more beloved to me than making tayammum. The Sheikh Ash-Shithri, hafidhullah ta'ala, he says, إذا وجد ماء يكفي لوضوئه فاضلا عن حاجته وجب عليه الوضوء ولو كان قليلا وأما إن كان لا يكفي إلا لبعض أعضائه فقال مالك وأبو حنيفة والشافعي في أحد قوليه يتيمم ويترك هذا الماء وقال أحمد والشافعي في القول الثاني عنه يتوضأ به ويتيمم لباقي الأعضاء وهذا أرجح. Sheikh Ash-Shithri, hafidhullah ta'ala, talking about the position of the four imams in this topic, he says that if the individual has or finds an amount of water that is sufficient for his wudu, and it will have enough to cover his wudu and fulfill his need, then it is obligatory upon him to make wudu, even if that water was a small amount. So if you find enough water, even if it's a small amount, for example, something like this, it's a small amount of water, right? If there's a small amount of water that will suffice your need, then it is obligatory to make wudu. He says, but as far as if the water is not sufficient, except to wash some of the limbs that are necessary, then Malik, Abu Hanifa, and Ash-Shafi'i, in one of his statements, says that the individual should simply make tayammum and he should leave the water. He does not need to use the water at all, but he can just automatically revert to making tayammum. He says, while Imam Ahmed and Ash-Shafi'i, in another of his statements, or the second of his statements, they say that the individual needs to make wudu with that water as much as they can, and then they make tayammum for the remaining limbs. And Ash-Shithri, hafidhullah, says that this is the more valid view. So, for example, if this is all the water that I had, in reality, this should be enough water to make wudu. But if this was all the water that I had, and let's suppose that this will run out by the time I finish my arms and wiping my head, then I still have to wash my feet. So according to Malik, Abu Hanifa, in one of the statements of Shafi'i, I wouldn't even use that water. I would just automatically revert to making tayammum. While according to Imam Ahmed, in the other view of Imam Shafi'i, I would make as much wudu as I could with that water, and then I would make tayammum for whatever I didn't get to wash or wipe from my limbs. And so this chapter is regarding the statement of the Salaf regarding this issue. Right? Whoever says that a small amount of water is more beloved to me than making tayammum. I prefer to use as much water as I had and then make tayammum more than just not using the little bit of water and going straight to tayammum. Ibn Abi Shayba, he says in this topic, he says, حدثنا حفص عن ليث عن طاووس قال الماء اليسير أحب إلي من التيمم. Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, he says that Hafs narrated to us on the authority of Layth, on the authority of Tawus. who said that a small amount of water is more beloved to me than making tayammum. He says حدثنا معن ibn Isa and Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Mujbir or al-Mujbar. Let's see. Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Mujbar. I would default to al-Mujbar, but it could be al-Mujbir. Al-Mujbar is where I would default. Why is it not coming up? Al-Mujbar. There we go. Al-Mujbir. And you also have Al-Mujabbar. So let me see if I can find the exact person. Al-Mujabbir and Al-Mujabbar. Abu al-Mujabbar أورده. Where's Tahdib? Al-Mujabbir. يقال Al-Mujabbir أيضا. Yahya ibn Yahya, that's a different individual. Al-Mujabbir. Al-Mujbir. Al-Mujbir. Al-Mujbar. Who is his name? Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman. Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman. Yeah. So it could be Al-Mujbir, Al-Mujabbir, Al-Mujabbar, or Al-Mujbar. He doesn't mention anything. He says in the footnotes that they have a mistake, Al-Muhayyar, and so it might be on the scale Al-Mujabbar. Like that we'll say it. He says, حدثنا معن ibn Isa. He says that Ma'an ibn Isa narrated to us on the authority of Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Mujabbar, on the authority of Abdul Rahman ibn al-Qasim, that al-Qasim, yani al-Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, he used to wipe on the traces of where he would get his yani mahajimihi, his hijama, with water. He would wipe on the places where he would get hijama done with water. And I don't know what this has to do with the chapter. Whoever says a little bit of water is beloved to me than making tayammum. كان يمسح أثر المحاجم بالماء. He would wipe off the traces of where he got his hijama done with water. He would wash the blood off and wipe it off with water. But I don't know what this has to do with the chapter. So Allah knows best. And this is something that you see sometimes, is that the narrations might be in places where they don't belong. And this is something that's normal in how they report hadith. Maybe somebody just included this hadith in this section. They forgot to write it down in another section. Their eyes got transposed, the same way we talked about how chapters can alter and be different. It's similar to how you might find a hadith sometimes where nobody can figure out why it's in that chapter. Oh, that's why my page got flipped. Now it makes sense. I turned too many pages. Nah, that's why, because the next chapter is about what to do with hijama. I apologize. So let's disregard that narration. We mentioned the narration of Tawus. The next narration, he says, حدثنا خالد ibn Hayyan and Ja'far ibn Burqan and Habib ibn Abi Marzuq and Ata قال القليل من الماء أحب إلي من التراب. He says that Khalid ibn Hayyan narrated to us on the authority of Ja'far ibn Burqan, on the authority of Habib ibn Abi Marzuq, on the authority of Ata, who said that a small amount of water is more beloved to me than dirt, i.e. I would prefer using the small amount of water I have before making tayammum. He says, حدثنا جرير and Mughira and Hamad and Ibrahim أنه قال الوضوء بالطرق من الماء أحب إلي من التيمم. He says that Jarir narrated to us on the authority of Mughira, on the authority of Hamad, on the authority of Ibrahim, yani al-Nakha'i. He said that making wudu that has been approached, i.e. that water that is on the road that the animals use and drink and urinate and enter into, he says making wudu with that water of the path, al-wudu bit-turuq, that water that has been matruqa, that water that has been approached, is more beloved to me than making tayammum, right? And so this goes back to what we talked about, like for the truck driver or something like that, how that becomes important. Making wudu with that water that is on the side of the road is more beloved to me than making tayammum. I prefer that an individual does that than make tayammum. So when we find, people in the car, they're on a road trip, they say, oh, you know what, let's just make tayammum. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, he said, al-wudu bil-turuq min al-ma' ahabbu ilayya min at-tayammum. Making wudu with that water that is on the side of the road, or that water that has been approached by the animals, is more beloved to me than making tayammum. He says, حدثنا عبد الصمد ابن عبد الوارث حدثنا عبد الصمد ابن عبد الوارث عن جرير بن حازم عن حماد قال سئل عن الماء القليل الذي لا يبلغ الطهور فقال الصعيد أحب إلي منه. He says that Abdul Samid ibn Abdul Warith narrated to us on the authority of Jarir ibn Hazim, on the authority of Hamad, and Allah knows best, Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, the teacher of Abu Hanifa. He said, i.e. the Jarir ibn Hazim said that Hamad was asked about a small amount of water that has not reached the amount of tahur. Right? If you have a small amount of water, and let's suppose that it has changed its taste, color, or smell, and it has not reached the amount that we would say is a lot of water, so therefore it is still tahur, what should you do with that water? To which Hamad, he responded, he said, as-sa'id ahabbu ilayya minhu. Using the dirt is more beloved to me than that. Making tayammum is more beloved to me than using that water that is a small amount that maybe some of its qualities have changed, right? And that's another way to look at this chapter, right? We said the chapter could be looked at using a small amount of water before making tayammum. And it could also be referred to as if there's a small amount of water that its taste, color, or smell has changed, and so it hasn't reached the quality of being a large body of water where it can push off some of those harms. Like the Prophet said in the hadith, إِذَا بَلَغَ الْمَاءُ الْقُلَّتَيْنِ لَا يَحْمِلُ الْخَبَثِ, right? أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. When water reaches to qulla, nothing, it doesn't carry impurities. But when it's a small amount, those impurities might remain. And so if the taste or color or smell has changed and it's a small amount of water, should you make tayammum or should you use that water? So these are two different ways to interpret this chapter. We saw some of the narrations before mentioning or discussing the chapter from the aspect of using the water before making tayammum. But now we see the transition of, what if the water is a small amount and perhaps has changed? Is it tahir to where we should go make tayammum, or is it tahur still, even though it's changed in its small state? And so we mentioned the statement of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, where that using that small amount of water that is from the turuq is more beloved than making tayammum, that water that has changed because of the animals going in and out and drinking from and urinating. While Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, he is saying that that water that is a small amount that isn't quite tahur, it's not purely pure, it might have changed some of its qualities, then he says, no, I prefer that you make tayammum. The last narration, he says, حدثنا ابن مبارك عن ابن لهيعة قال سمعت عطاء يقول إذا توضأت فلم تعمم فتيمم. Here he goes back to the other understanding of what it's meant by saying using a small amount of water is more beloved than making tayammum. He says that Ibn Mubarak narrated to us on the authority of Ibn Lahiyah, who said, I heard Ata saying, if you make wudu and you don't cover everything, then make tayammum. If you make wudu and that water that you have doesn't allow you to cover everything, then make tayammum. Right? And so this is the response to what we talked about. Like we said, some scholars say you go straight to tayammum, you don't use the water. Some scholars say you make wudu and then you make tayammum for what's left. While somebody might try to say, well, no, I made wudu for what I had and then I ran out of water, so that's sufficient. And we would say, no, if you ran out of water and you didn't cover every body part, then make tayammum for what is left. And like that, we would have finished that chapter. The next chapter, which we'll pick up with next time, is the chapter Man kana yatawaddau idha ihtajam. Those who used to make wudu whenever they did hijama. And so we'll see the significance of that narration that we just read on Al-Qasim in that chapter. But we'll stop at that amount. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. Is it Ajin? Is what Ajin? Like we said, Ajin water is that water that has, because of how long it has sat still, right? It's not flowing water. So flowing water, it purifies itself, constantly running over the rocks and moving. This causes the water to purify itself. It serves as a filter. But the water that is stagnant, whether it be a pond, a puddle, or even, water that might be in a cup, when that water is stagnant, sometimes it can cause it to change its taste, color, or smell. And so those bodies of water, that type of water is called Ajin, because the change has occurred not because of proximity, nor because of mixing, nor because of dilution. It's just changed by itself. There hasn't been anything that was a catalyst to the change. And so that is considered water that is Ajin. Wa iyak. Wa ilaykum aqul. So can we combine wudu and tayammum? Yes, like we said, that the statement of Ata, if you run out of water, this was the statement of Imam Shafi'i in one of his statements, as well as Imam Ahmed. If you run out of water during your wudu, then you should make tayammum for what is left. And that's because Allah says, فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. And if you don't find any water, then make tayammum. And that statement is general. So you found water to wash your face and wash your arms and wipe your head, but you didn't find water to wash your feet. So the ayat is now applicable for you for your feet. And if you don't find any water, then make tayammum, or then seek out clean earth. So in this circumstance, you can combine between tayammum and wudu. You can combine between wudu and tayammum. Now, there are other circumstances where there's disagreement. Should you do both? Like, for example, sometimes, like you'll see in the madhahib, they say if you have water that is tahir, right? Water that some of the scholars say it is clean, but it's not permissible to make wudu with. And so you might find some of them say, but you're not sure if it's tahir or tahur, then make wudu with it, which is fine, and then make tayammum. So they say if the water was tahir and you made tayammum, you've covered your base. And if the water was tahur and you made tayammum, you've covered your base. And so these are some arguments that you might say, well, no, you don't need to do both of them. Either the water is tahur or it's not, right? But in this circumstance, if you run out of water while making wudu, we would say, yes, you should make tayammum for whatever body parts. Your niyyah when making the tayammum is for whatever body part didn't get water. Al-ma al-ajin. Nah. I think we answered al-ma al-ajin. And Allah knows best. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. وفيكم بارك الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.